Welcome to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast. Today I'm thrilled to have Nicola McDougall, chairperson of PIPA, as my guest, and we're going to discuss how our property markets have become a political play toy. There's lots to unpack, but it's crucial for investors to understand the implications of the increased interference by governments in our property markets. We're also going to discuss the latest Taxation Office statistics showing how many property investors there really are in Australia and how many properties they own. And you're going to hear how more and more investors are thinking of jumping ship. Hey, don't do that though. But let's jump right into it so you'll understand what's going on.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney Podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Today, I'd like to tackle a subject that's been making waves in the property investment community, the intersection of politics and property markets. It's a jungle out there, and as investors, it's crucial to keep your finger on the pulse of all these latest developments. And my guest today is Nicola McDougall, chairperson of PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, and she's in the thick of things. Welcome, Nicola.
Thank you for having me on the show again, Michael. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, it's alarming how much the landscape's changed since we last spoke. And, Nicola, it's not for the better. The influences of politics on property is causing some serious ripples. At the end of last year, Nicola, PIPA's annual sentiment survey and similarly Property Update's sentiment survey showed that up to about 30% of respondents said they'd consider selling an investment property this year. But boy, the landscape's got a lot worse than it was then, Nicola. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, exactly. And I remember when we chatted last year, Michael, that was that after, I think, when the survey came out, and it was a lot to do with the Queensland interstate land tax, which ultimately was axed. And at that point in time, it was, our survey showed a huge volume of investors looking to sell for a variety of reasons, with the Queensland land tax being one at the time, but also the sort of second, third and fourth reasons why investors were looking to sell in the next 12 months was the fact that they feel that they've lost control of their assets.
I think that was the main reason, Nicola.
Yeah, that was in August last year. So it's nearly August again. So we run the survey every year in August. So it'll be our 9th one this year. And like you said in your intro then, Michael, things have got worse from that moment. We've seen some latest data from CoreLogic showing that the average number of, what they believe are investment properties being sold around the nation has really ticked up quite significantly compared to historical averages over the last, 6 or 12 months.
Well, interestingly, both Domain and realestate.com, the two big property portals, showed something similarly. I think realestate.com said about 25% of properties currently listed for sale were on the rental market. And they'd know that because they'd see from their statistics that property was up for lease a while ago. And Domain said it was close to 30%. So investors are selling up. In the industry, people are talking about that as well. The rent rolls for the various big agencies are decreasing, and most of these properties are being sold to owner-occupiers. What that means is there's even less in the rental pool at present, Nicola.
That's right, and that's what our survey showed last year. And I would like to, think that perhaps, my efforts or PIPA's efforts and your own have really started to get some of these data houses to actually do those investor-specific stats because they didn't really exist before. And when we asked those questions in the investor sentiment survey last year, we asked the intentions of investors. What have they done? What are you thinking of doing? And who did you sell to? And that was when we were able to create that wonderful data set last year, which showed the significant volume of investors who had sold properties to generally owner-occupiers and that had stripped hundreds of thousands of rental properties out of the market in the last 2 years. And since then, it's been nice to see from a data point of view a lot more investor-specific data. So we all have a better handle and understanding of what investors are doing. And unfortunately, at the moment, they are continuing to offload their properties in great volumes. And part of the reason why one would think is the increased holding costs because of none of us probably this time last year, thought that rates would get to the level that they have done. The investor sentiment survey this year, which will be happening in 6 weeks, I think the results from those will be very telling indeed.
Well, let's put some context to this. Now, CoreLogic and the Australian Bureau of Statistics tell us there's 10.9 million dwellings in Australia, and recently it's ticked up to $9.6 trillion of the total value of Australia's residential real estate market. And people are saying that these ugly, greedy landlords taking advantage of tenants. We'll talk about the landlord bashing in a moment. But the Australian Taxation Office showed that about 20% of Australia's taxpayers, 2,245,000 Australians, own an investment property. But when you look at that, 71.48, so 72% own one property, 18% own two properties. There's only 19,900 investors who own 6 or more properties. And Nicola, this is despite the podcast, the blogs, PIPA, giving education, websites, YouTube. The number of Australians who own 1 or 2 properties just hasn't increased over time. The percentage remains much the same.
Exactly. And as we've talked about before, Michael, whether on this show or just generally as friends, unfortunately, that lack of education, and certainly in decades gone by, the lack of expert assistance meant that a lot of investors perhaps were accidental. They may have inherited a property. They may have kept their previous home and bought another property and turned one of their properties into an investment property. And so they didn't ever really intend to be an investor, I suppose. Or you have, unfortunately, a cohort who went out on their own and purchased something that was inferior and therefore, perhaps never had any significant capital growth, or the cash flow was always poor. They bought in an underperforming location, and then their ability to actually leverage from that was always poor. So they ended up being stuck with one investment property or maybe 2, and they were unable to do anything more because they actually chose the wrong asset to start off with. One would have hoped in the last 10 years, we did start to see an increase. When you look at those stats, Michael, and they only came out last week or the week before last, we did, up until the pandemic, start to see a reasonable, there wasn't increases a little bit, I suppose, in the number of investors in the market. However, that's fallen off a cliff since the 2019-2020 financial year. Of course, investors, what started happening in 2014, 2015 was the APRA lending restrictions, which prevented a lot of investors from gaining access to finance. And that's when, the number of investors in the market compared to historical averages started to fall. But certainly in that new data, and PIPA released something last week about this, the number of investors, net investors in the market started to fall dramatically from 2019, 2020, and has continued going down quite significantly from that point.
Well, let's explain that a bit further. The Australian Taxation Office gives statistics each year about how many property investors there are, how many property investments they own, whether they're negatively geared, and things like that. Now, the latest statistics, which, as you say, only came out a short while ago, are for the 2020-21 financial year. So they're a couple of years out of date. But if we go back a decade or so, the net number of investors increasing each year. In other words, new investors came in the market, some sold up, used to be 60, 70, 80,000 increase each year. Over COVID, it decreased a lot, 2019, 2020. But in the 2020-21 year, there was only an increase of close to 19,000 investors. In other words, fewer people are getting in the market. And you're right, Nicola, the downturn started in 2014. And maybe I could just quickly go through some of the things that investors have had to put up with, and then we can break them down, because we've known each other for a long time. You remember in 2014, APRA started to throttle the bank's ability to lend to investors. They were worried there were too many investors. And look, to be fair, I remember at that stage, probably 50% of all properties being bought in Sydney at the time went to investors. And that was, I guess, a bit of a problem, wasn't it?
It was.
And then 2016, APRA limited interest-only lending, again trying to limit investors. And then in 2017, the Federal Labor Party came in and they threatened about removing removing negative gearing, and that scared investors. Of course, that's not a reason to invest, but it's nice cream on the cake if you can get a bit of a tax deduction as well. And then in 2017, depreciation claims, the ability to depreciate items was decreased. APRA kept interfering with things along the way, eventually lifting lending buffers to 3% in 2021. Back in Victoria in 2020, the Victorian government had massive tenancy law reforms. I know our property management division had lots of difficulty keeping up with I can't remember, 83 changes. Queensland residential reforms came in. Western Australia and ACT are now proposing tenancy reforms. Property investors have been in some ways being used as an ATM by governments and as scapegoats. It's political football, isn't it?
It always is. And when we think about the fact that the best investors are the ones that invest with a long-term mindset, right? So you're talking about having a couple of decades or more in the market. Now, when you're getting thrown all of these different changes all of the time, it's very unsettling because you're actually putting your money down. You're taking all the risks as the investor or the homeowner, and you're saying, I want to, in an ideal world, I would like to hold on to this asset for, let's call it 30 years or even 40 years if you start in your 20s, However, so you've got this, you're looking for the horizon, but geez, the last 10 years, that horizon has so many lumps and bumps and forks in the road and this and that lever pulled. It's almost like rock slides here and there if you're doing a road analogy. I'm just making up on the spot. But there's all of these things that are being thrown at them all of the time, which is very easy to knock them off kilter and go, you know what, I'm exhausted. This is too much. I can't keep wearing all these continual sort of financial blows. I've had enough. I'm out, which was not good for rent. Clearly not good for renters, as we've seen, and clearly not good for these people who actually were aspirational individuals who actually wanted to go out there and do something to improve their financial position in life. And generally speaking, most of them would have only purchased one or two properties. But a lot of them may have ended up in retirement, not being eligible for the pension, being self-funded retirees, so they weren't being a burden on the public purse. But then because of all of these, financial imposts, which then it's never ending. And those of us who've been doing this a long time, I've been on the PIPA board for 10 years next year, 2014, which was when those APRA changes come in, it's certainly been a very interesting decade. And the rental undersupply that we have now is because of the continued attacks on investors that have taken place over the last decade.
Well, let's make that clear. At the moment, vacancy rates are the lowest they've been in the time I've been involved in property, which is now over 5 decades, and there's no end in sight to that. And people are saying, it's all due to immigration happening. The rental vacancy rates dropped before our borders opened up again. They're saying it's due to foreign investors. They're coming up with all sorts of excuses. But the bottom line is the government, its job is to provide social housing, and we all understand that's necessary. There'll always be disenfranchised people, but they're not even doing enough of that. But they're not in the business of providing accommodation for that third of Australians who choose to rent because they want to, not necessarily because they're poor. It may just be a stage of their life they're at. They're moving interstate, they've got divorced, they're building a new house. So a lot of people have to rent, and somebody's got to provide that accommodation. And that's really just a function of small business that Australians are taking up. Mum and dads are, but they're sick of it.
And I think I'll ask you a question, Michael, without notice. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, but you've been doing it much longer. If we think about, the increase in investors, which happens from about, 3 decades ago, in your experience, clearly governments used to fund social and affordable housing to a far greater degree than they do now. When investors started coming into the market more late 90s, I presume, with those tax changes, in your experience, do you feel that the governments have gone, okay, we don't need to do this anymore because investors are doing it, and we're giving them a bit of negative gearing, and notwithstanding the facts that no one really talks about the huge amount of capital gains tax we all have to pay at some point.
And stamp duty.
Yeah, stamp duty, and all the fact that, if you're an investor, you just have to pay higher fees for everything. I don't know why, but I just wanted to ask you, because you've actually been at the coalface of this throughout this whole change, and the fact that governments now are trying to, like, I don't know, that obviously they're trying to backpedal as fast as they can, but the die was cast decades ago, right?
Well, interestingly, that's the way the Australian government handles a number of things. So overseas, if you go to England, for example, there's a lot of community housing in Europe as well. But in Australia, with the public transport system, there's private buses and there's public transport, and the private buses are supported by subsidies by the government. There's private hospitals and public hospitals. They work in tandem. There's private education and public education. And in this provision of accommodation, the government's done the same, but it's actually decided it's actually going to spend more money. I guess there's only limited funds around, so it's actually left it to more the private sector, and it's not corporations, because there's not enough money in it for big corporations to get involved in the small tenancies, so they've left it to ordinary Australians. And yes, you're right, they've given them incentives to do things, and it's a business. So if I was to open up a dog wash business, I should be able to charge as much as I want or not, and let the market decide whether I can make a living. And the government shouldn't interfere with how much I charge for my dog washes. And if I buy equipment for my dog wash, I should be able to make it tax deductible. And if it doesn't work some years, I've actually got some negative gearing benefits because I may make a loss. But they allow all sorts of other businesses to do that. But property investors, they interfere with them more than any other small businesses, because I guess there's been a swing to the left. And let's be blunt, there's been a swing to these independent Green parties who, look, they probably think, I'm sure they think they're doing the right thing, but they don't understand the way the real estate market works, do they?
Well, it's almost like they don't understand basic economics.
No.
Really?
No.
There was a great op-ed in the Fin yesterday by Craig Emerson, actually, which I read that. If anyone gets a chance to read that, or yourself, it was amazing, just pretty much saying that. That first year economics 101 at uni would teach you about supply and demand. And that's all you really need to understand. And the Greens don't. Clearly they don't. All they're doing is populist politics, where they think, well, this is the chance that we've got to show the majority of our voters, who, let's be honest, are renters, that we are standing up for them and going to help them, when realistically, if such a thing, and the reason why we're talking about this is the rumours at this point that the Victorian Labor government is going to instigate some type of rental freeze. If that happens, then, my lord, the number of investors that have exited the market is about to increase even more, I would imagine.
Well, let's go back that the Greens have asked for rental freezes or rental caps. But I remember PIPA bringing out some statistics last year from your previous chairman, Peter Kalitzis, who showed that over the last decade, rents have not kept pace with inflation. So, yes, they have gone up double-digit growth. Yes, they've skyrocketed in the last year. But nobody complained when you and I as landlords had to reduce our rents over the COVID period to allow people to keep their homes. And over a decade, rents haven't kept up with inflation. But yeah, they're just doing what market forces do at the moment. But as you say, it is supply and demand, and if investors get out of the market, there's going to be less supply, increasing demand, and rents are going to go up. But yes, I was disappointed to hear that the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas, let slip that the government's considering rental caps just to appease the Greens so that they can get their budget through. That's a very scary thought. But recently, PIPA came up with a report suggesting that Victoria was the worst state for renters. What do you mean by that?
Well, exactly, because I guess maybe we should do this on a yearly thing, and maybe it will be the worst state and the best state. This
Good
time
idea.
last year, if we had this conversation, we would have given that award, or the bad award, to Queensland, right? But now, clearly, Victoria, not only, and I think it's somewhere north of 100 rental reforms that have been happening in Queensland over the last few years. In their state budget a couple of months ago, they have also increased land tax for all property, anyone that owns a second property in Victoria, for the next 10 years to pay back some of the money that they spent during the pandemic. So you've got investors there who are likely to be stung with increased land tax bill of several $1,000s per year at least for the next 10 years. And now, as I say, as you just mentioned as well, Michael, the Victorian Labor government appears to be the only state government who's actually considering bending to the blackmail that the Greens are putting the pressure on, the federal Labor government at the moment, and considering rental freezes. So this is the reason why we labelled Victoria as the worst state in the nation for renters, because of all of these attacks on investors, which will fundamentally mean there will be a smaller supply of rental properties available for sale, because investors will either not get into the market. I actually have had quite a few emails from investors who are either exiting the market in Victoria or people who are considering investing in Victoria and decided to go elsewhere. So all of these things mean there's going to be a lower supply of rental properties. And if we go back to simple economics, for those of us who do understand it, if there's a low supply of something, then generally that means there's higher demand and prices go up.
Well, only yesterday, my sister, who owns 3 investment properties and is considering retiring over the next couple of years, said, I've actually had enough. I actually want to sell. When's a good time to sell? Should I do it now? Should I wait? And I explained to her that it's the wrong thing to do. What did you get into property for? And over the long term, if there are fewer investment properties, even though there will be rental caps and rental freezes, they may be, eventually when a tenant moves out, you'll be able to get up to market again. Don't make 30-year investment decisions based on the last 30 minutes of news, is the advice I gave her. But you can understand how many people would feel that way. Now, I know our mutual friend Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors had a look at how investors felt in that short period of time in Queensland where there was changes in land tax. And he felt that not only did investors sell up, but others chose just not to invest in that state in Queensland, even though those land tax changes were repealed.
That's right. And I think the thing is, while they were repealed, and it was September last year, they actually announced them in December the year prior. So it was, the best part, 9 months of knowing that they were coming in or potentially coming in, and then they did come in, and obviously they've had to backflip within 3 months. So I think, that amount of time is enough for investors to make up their own mind whether Queensland is a place for them or not. Look, if you had got into the market back then in Queensland, like you said, don't base a decision on what's happening in the last 30 minutes. You would have done quite well in certain parts of the Queensland market. Certainly from a capital growth point of view, the market's actually doing very well here because of the undersupply of sale listings. So those of us who held our nerves, and as someone who owns a portfolio in Queensland, that was never probably something that I would have considered at the time, because I do have a bit of time on my side. But a lot of people, it might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. And after a number of years of levers being pulled, or the issues that we all had in regards to the emergency residential tenancies that were put in place during the pandemic, like your sister perhaps, sometimes people just go, you know what, I've had enough. But I agree with you, Michael. As you know, I do have a property in my portfolio that, I shouldn't have bought. Let's be honest. But there is one that, over the years, when I first bought it, the rent was $465 a week in 2013. It's currently $500 a week. At one point during the oversupply here in Brisbane, the rent went down to $380 a week. It was actually empty for 10 weeks at one point, and I think about 2017. The rent has started to nudge up a little bit. I was able to put up the rent a little bit in January, and it was put up to $500 a week. So as I say, when I bought it, it was $465 10 years ago, $500. Queensland government brought in the rental caps of 1 annual increase per year, which, as a policy, look, we can kind of live. I think
you can live with that.
However, they made it retrospective. So someone like me, who put up the rent marginally in January, wasn't able to increase the rent again this year. So I had renewed the tenancy on that property for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into today. So, but fundamentally, but my mortgage is coming off a fixed rate next month, and the interest-only mortgage on that property is going up $1,200 a month. So really, I might have been able to get maybe $100 more a week, maybe let's call it $75. So we're talking about $300 a month in additional rent, and my mortgage is $1,200 a month higher. So then that's the reality for most investors when they're talking about these rental freezes. Well, let's put a freeze on mortgage repayments then. Let's put a freeze on electricity prices. Let's put a freeze on all of these things, which clearly would never happen. But you can't put a freeze on income when people's expenses are going through the roof. And what we'll see now, unfortunately, during the pandemic and the emergency low interest rates we had, and it probably come up on those ATO stats, Michael, the number of people that reported negatively geared properties fell because we had really low interest rates. Now that we've got, that significant increases in mortgage repayments, even with rents increasing, the number of negatively geared investors is probably going to increase. And so then that argument will start all over again at a policy level at some point, because all of this stuff, you and I, we've been doing this a long time. None of it's new.
Goes round in circles.
Let's be honest.
Nicola, you and I have been around a long time, and I think this is a good thing to remind people that I've been investing long enough. I remember in 1987 when they removed negative gearing, and I just kept my property, and a year or two later they repeated negative gearing again. I've seen high interest rates, low interest rates. I've been through periods where my rents have gone up and long periods when the values of my properties remained flat and rents didn't go up. We've had recessions. But over the long term, residential real estate in our capital cities, not according to just the property research houses, but the official government statistician, the ATO, agrees that property values have gone up about 7 to 8% per annum on average, which means they double every 10 years, but not going up consistently every year. So play property as a long-term game, and you've got to have the right financial buffers in place. We're going through a challenging time at the moment, and I agree with you. I'm not surprised that people are considering getting out. In fact, I was shocked at a recent survey by the REIQ, which I know you work closely together with, suggested that more than 80% of property investors warn they may sell up their investment properties if the Queensland government keeps hitting them with reforms. Nicola, I'm just seeing a tendency by state governments to try and take away more and more control from property investors and push it in favour of the tenants. And boy, we've got other options with our investments. We don't have to provide the accommodation the government's not providing.
That's right. And this sort of stuff has happened in the past before too, right, Michael? It's like deja vu, and sometimes it's quite exhausting because we've had periods where the pendulum in regards to tenants and investors has swung towards renters, and then some might argue it's swung a little bit more to investors. Often that's about market intervention because they feel like they have to do something because the market's doing something at some point in time. By the time they do something, the market's sorted itself out, but you're stuck with these rental reforms, which no longer really, well, they should never have. I don't believe in market intervention of any kind. So, free market, that's what we should be having, because at the end of the day, the market sorts itself out every single time. But governments decide that they need to show that they're doing something. And certainly at the moment, clearly we have a lot of Labor, well, it's all Labor governments around the country, isn't it? So that is not unsurprising given their politics and their constituents. Now, of course, which is really unusual, is that we have the Labor in an argy-bargy with the Greens, which no one would have ever thought that would happen. But I must admit, sitting back here and seeing how firmly the federal Labor government is not bending to what the Greens think that they need to achieve, that's good to see that the Labor government is actually understanding that how the market works and how supply and demand works. And if the rental freeze, if they ever thought about somehow coordinating all the state premiers to instigate some rental freezes, well, that would be like rental Armageddon, I suppose. So it is nice that the federal government is actually out there, recognising the vital role that investors play. And as someone who's been involved in lobbying now for 17 years, I haven't really seen that before. Clearly, it was only 2019 when the opposition Labor went to the federal election with scrapping negative gearing as their key policy, and that actually lost them the election. So there has been somewhat of a turnaround in the last 4 years.
I guess we should also make a distinction between social housing and the provision of rental accommodation for people who choose not to buy, as we said a moment ago. So I don't think either of us or anyone disagrees that the government should provide social housing, and we know it hasn't done that sufficiently. It was really disappointing to see two different sets of statistics from Victoria and New South Wales showing the increase in homelessness. And a lot of these people have got mental health issues or drug issues. And I believe it's our responsibility, that's what we pay taxes for, that the government should supply social housing. And we know they haven't been doing that enough. But then there's also that close to 3 million Australians, all those families who've chosen to rent for various reasons, some in the long term, some in the short term. Somebody's got to provide that accommodation. And we know that 500,000 more people called Australia home last year alone, and it's going to probably be even more in the year 2023. And they don't bring homes with them. They bring cash. Either their parents are paying for their student accommodation here, or they're bringing fat checkbooks because they're coming here to get new jobs. And there's no end in sight because we're just not building enough accommodation. So, Nicola, I don't see this problem going away. I think we're going to be talking about this next time we get together.
100%. And when the federal government announced last year about that massive increase in overseas migration, I posted on my LinkedIn and went, where are they going to live? And again, it's just another example of populist politics and policies where they need to be, all they're thinking about is, their current term or, halfway through their current term, winning the next term. And they're actually not thinking about the decisions that they make or the market interventions that they create and what the long-term ramifications are of that. And clearly they announced, that massive overseas migration at a time when we already had a rental crisis going on. What are we going to do? We're going to have migrant camps like the 1950s, because where are these people supposed to go? And not only that, maybe some of them, I did read a report the other day about Australia, not just students, but a lot of higher net worth individuals migrate to Australia as well. You're probably seeing a lot of overseas money coming into our country, which will displace our current residents. And you'll start to see, for example, the Sunshine Coast, where I own property, you are starting to see a lot of people having to migrate north of the Sunshine Coast because they can't afford to live there anymore. So you're starting to see people living in Gympie and Bundaberg, more affordable locations. I'm sure that's happening in other parts of all over the country. And that generally is what happens when people can't afford to stay where they usually have lived. And that's clearly a problem when you've got essential workers who are unable to, live close to their places of employment. I just don't see any version of the current crisis where it's fixed anytime soon. We're probably talking about, I don't know, what do you think, Michael? It's probably going to be pretty dire for...
It's a nightmare, and I've never seen it like this. Unless they come up with a
way of incentivising more people to invest in property.
Well, I think that's the answer. So, as you said a moment ago, we're getting more wealthy migrants coming. Australia has just recently retained its spot as the number one destination for high net worth individuals. And that was the fact that they had over $1 million US of investable assets after beating the UAE and other places. So Henley Private Wealth Migration Report showed more and more wealthy people are coming to Australia. What's the answer? I think, and some will say it's not popular, allowing foreign investors to come back, because they're the ones that underpinned those big apartment towers. Now, I know neither you or I believe that's a good way of investing, but somebody has to build those apartment towers. That was underpinned by a lot of those pre-purchases, off-the-plan purchases. But I think just as importantly, you've got to allow people like you, me, my sister that I mentioned a while ago, to incentivise us to keep investing in property, because the government is not doing it. So rather than attacking us, give us incentives, help us. But we're not even asking for incentives. Just give us certainty.
Yes, that's right, and give us, the certainty that we can hold on to these assets for the long term versus, sort of kind of like you get whiplash, really.
Yeah.
Whiplash when there's this is happening, that's happening, the headline says this, the headline says that, as you've talked about a lot, Michael, in your business, in your books, and your blogs, publicly at events, talking about, ignoring all of the noise and focusing on the horizon. But for a lot of people, unfortunately, they are unable to do that. When you have all these alarmist predictions, which is another thing that really annoys me, all those alarmist predictions on prices last year and during COVID and during the GFC, And none of them, alarmist predictions from certain people who are still out there who predicted massive price falls, which never came to pass, but that scared a lot of people and they sold their properties, versus those of us in the know who go, well, okay, I bet your bottom dollar that's going to be the opposite of that or thereabouts, and here we are again. But no one gets called to account from these ridiculous forecasts that go out there, and it's just scaremongering. And for a lot of, unfortunately, for far too many home buyers or smaller property investors, mum and dad investors who are the majority, that scares the bejesus out of them, and they sell up. And that takes one more property out of the rental supply, but it also means that their financial future is going to be worse than it would have been if someone out there, for the sake of clickbait, didn't come up with some ridiculous forecast, not caring about the ramifications of some of these things that are put out there in the public forum. And that's the thing that really annoys me the most, is a lot of people don't understand the negative impact they have on people's psyche and also on their potential to improve their financial lot in life, even in a small way, because that's all they're trying to do, and no one seems to care about that.
There are some people out there who don't like seeing their fellow Australians get ahead. Well, we've talked about a whole lot of negatives, so let's finish off on a positive note.
Yes.
Australia's the best place to live in the world. We are so lucky to be here. We are living at the best time in history. Sure, we got problems, but we've got all these conveniences today that our parents and grandparents didn't have. And yes, we're going to have troubles with more migrants coming in, but imagine what it's going to be like for our children and grandchildren in the future, this lovely country. And let's remember, property investment's a long-term game. It's not a one-off event. It's a process. And you really got to think about, as you said a moment ago, what's the sort of property I want to own over the next 20, 30, 40 years, or even longer if I want to leave it to future generations. So don't let all this short-term news affect your long-term goals. Nicola McDougall, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael. It's always wonderful to be here.
I hope you weren't put off too much by my discussion with Nicola, because yes, the state governments are interfering and there are going to be challenges ahead. But those who can play the long game, those who've got the right finance buffers in place, those who can see the big picture are going to be the ones who win out, because I guess there will be fewer property investors around, and the supply and demand ratio will mean that rents are going to go up and investment properties are going to go up. And that's despite the interest rate rises, that's despite the consumer sentiment problems, and that's despite all the property pessimists out there. You see, property prices are not going to fall when there's a severe undersupply of housing, as we're currently experiencing, both the sales and the rental market. House prices aren't going to fall in the future when vacancy rates are less than 1% and rents are skyrocketing as they currently are. House prices aren't going to fall when unemployment is at around 3.5%, 3.6%. And anyone who wants a job can get a job and able to pay for their mortgages. House prices don't fall when auction rates remain above the 70% range. But yeah, we're going to have challenges, but there's also an extra 500,000 people coming to Australia that have turned the supply and demand ratio on its head. And these high immigration numbers, as I started to say when I chatted with Nicola, are likely to continue for quite some time, and we just can't produce enough housing stock for them. So I can see challenges ahead, but I can also see opportunities for those who want to take advantage of this beginning of the current new property cycle and own the sort of properties that are going to be in continuous strong demand by tenants and by owner-occupiers. But if you're not sure what to do, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? Go to metropole.com.au and have an obligation-free clarity consultation with one of our property strategists. By the way, we're much more than just buyer's agents. We start by giving you strategic property and wealth advice, and only then will we find the right property that will fit in with the plan that our team have built together with you. So now's a great time to get your ducks in a row, to get set for opportunities that are going to abound. But be careful. Property investment's a process. It's not an event. And in these challenging times, you can't just buy any property. So have a chat with my team at Metropole, metropole.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to discuss with you 6 destructive habits that could be holding you back. Now, you probably know by now I'm a fan of habits. I've written a book. It's actually a bestseller with Tom Corley, Rich Habits, Poor Habits, and it's been translated into quite a number of languages. So that's a great book, Rich Habits, Poor Habits, if you're interested in learning. But let me teach you something a bit different today. And it's not really about money habits, but when you talk about habits, there are good ones, and of course, habits that are not so productive. Some are bad habits. They're not good for us. They stop us from succeeding, and they reinforce negative patterns that we've picked up from our parents, our friends, our colleagues. Now, let's be blunt, no one's perfect, but I've found that most successful people find ways to replace their bad habits with good ones. Success in life, after all, is really just a series of good habits put into action over and over again. But in order to eliminate your bad habits, your poor habits, and form productive habits, we need to identify the destructive ones. So I want to give you a little checklist of 6 of the all-time bad habits. And as I go through these, see if any of these are relevant to you and what you can get rid of. Now, the first one I want to discuss with you today is thinking that the world owes you a favour. I can't tell you how often I come across this. A lot of people are quick to blame others when things go wrong, and they fail to take responsibility for the role they must have played as part of the situation. Of course, sometimes people do have a run of bad luck or are treated badly, but that's different from playing the victim all the time. Think about people in your own personal social circle, your friends, your family. I'm sure there's at least one person there you can think of who always blames others for their bad fortune. Tiring, isn't it? And they never actually get to the next level, do they? Fact is, there's no rich or successful victims, so the world doesn't owe you a favour. It was here before you were there. You're the pilot of your life. You're responsible for what's going on. Now, another bad, destructive habit I'd like you to consider, see if you've got or somebody you know has got, and that's giving up too easily. Of course setbacks will happen. They happen to everyone. Boy, have I had my share of failures and setbacks. Look, it's easy to look at other people's successes and think they got an easy ride. Most of the time they didn't. They just didn't let the setback stop them. So, depending upon how you were raised by your parents, you're either going to take the setbacks in your stride, or you're going to let them crush you. If you fall into the latter camp, then it's time to try and change this poor habit. Catch yourself every time you feel defeated and when something doesn't go your way, and change your way of thinking. Don't give up at the first hurdle. So, giving up too easily is a bad habit you should avoid. But there's also the opposite, not giving up when it's time, because a small number of people have got this opposite problem of not giving up too easily. It's the opposite. They don't know when to give up. They pour endless amounts of time, money, emotion into a project despite endless rejections and knockbacks. Rather than trying a different approach, they continue to butt their heads against the wall and they're not getting anywhere. This kind of blind pursuit, that's not resilience. It's, I guess, what I'd call stupidity. As important as it is to chase your dreams, it's equally important to know when to stop, when to take a breath, when to try something else. Another bad habit that you should ditch is not being curious. If you think you know it all, if you think you've got nothing left to learn, you're not going to get to the next level. In fact, it's foolish, isn't it? This kind of self-belief, it stops you from growing. It short-circuits your imagination. It stops you from developing new ideas. So I believe you should aim to be one of those people who always ask questions, and don't be surprised if some of the answers are ones that you don't agree with. Don't get stuck in your own head or in your own career. Don't get so stuck that you forget that other people are also leading interesting lives, and they may well have a role to play in yours moving forward as well. So always be on the lookout to learn more. Now, I know in some ways I'm preaching to the converted because you're already making an effort by listening to my podcast, by reading my blogs. It's good for you. It's good for your soul. The next bad habit that I suggest, if you've got it, you should ditch, is not looking after your health. I mean, a minute ago I was speaking about your soul. It's important to ditch unhealthy lifestyle habits. I guess that means no burning the candle at both ends. Of course you're busy. Everyone's busy at the moment. You're probably even busier than you ever have been. But you've got to find time to look after yourself, to find some time to exercise, find a regime that suits you, that you can stick to. Eat well, try and get lots of sleep. Sleep's really important, and maintain a decent level of fitness. Looking after your body will help ensure that you're in good shape when life throws those inevitable curveballs at you, and that you're fit enough to look after them. And the last of the 6 habits I'm going to suggest that you should look out for, their destructive habits that could be holding you back from the success you're looking for, is not looking after your finances. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I talk about money and finance in this podcast, because it's important to be financially fluent. Now, if you've got bad debts or you've got some credit cards that are not serving you, then work out how to get rid of those. The ability to look after your finances is one of the best predictors of long-term success. And I'm not just talking about money success or property investment success. If you learn money management skills, stick to a budget, save, understand the concept of delayed gratification, it shows that you've got this kind of self-control and maturity that's needed to be successful in other areas of your life and to see things through. Now, many of us have got one or more of these habits that I just mentioned, ones you need to work on. But you're also probably successful at some of these. I'm not suggesting that you've got all of these. Don't be complacent. Bad habits hold you back. They stop you from reaching your goals. And for some people, they can keep you poor, tired, and unhappy. So that's a good reason to ditch these bad habits and replace them with some good new ones. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?